Welcome to Then and Now, brought to you by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We are dedicated to studying change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every week, we interview thought leaders, historians, researchers, and policymakers about what happened then and what that means for us now.
Welcome to Then and Now, sponsored by the Luskin Center for History and Policy at UCLA. I'm David Myers. I teach in the UCLA Department of History and direct the Luskin Center, whose goal is to bring the past into conversation with the present, and in doing so, to understand how we got where we are so that we can imagine alternative and better futures. We are in the midst of one of the most tumultuous periods in recent memory, perhaps even in the history of the United States, a global pandemic, an unprecedented moment of racial reckoning, a profound crisis of democratic norms and institutions in the country. The month of January alone witnessed an extraordinary sequence of events, including an armed insurrection at the Capitol, a second impeachment of a president, and then an inauguration that some feared might not happen. The chaos of the time has sent historians back into the past to locate parallels or benchmarks with which to measure our present era. History, in this regard, serves as a guide to help us understand how we got where we are. And one branch of history, public history, seeks to make knowledge of the past widely available, not just to a community of scholars, but to the public at large. I'm pleased to welcome to Then and Now one of the country's most prominent public historians, Anthea Hartig, who, since 2019, has been at the helm of one of the country's preeminent sites of public history. Dr. Hartig is the Elizabeth Macmillan Director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. She came to this assignment from her previous post as Executive Director and CEO of the California Historical Society, where she served for 7 years. Few people know as well as she does the challenges and opportunities of history in the public domain. And so at this extraordinary moment in time, it seems fitting to talk to her about where we are and what the task of history is in this moment. Welcome to you, Anthea.
Oh, thank you so much, David. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you, as you said, at this incredible moment in time.
Incredible moment in time, which we will talk about, but we're going to retreat to the past and to your past to get a sense of how you got to where you are. So let's, in particular, talk about your path to Washington. You're a native Californian. You graduated from UCLA, where you had a proud history about what you want to hear, and spent the bulk of your professional career in the state. So what's your California story?
Oh, well, thank you so much for asking. And as you know, the risk of asking a historian about themselves, I'll try and be succinct. I was incredibly fortunate to grow up as a third-generation Californian on my father's side, in an era of what we thought was unprecedented change. But of course, just think about how much California has changed since I came into a small, suburban town of then Alta Loma. It wasn't even incorporated into Rancho Cucamonga yet, in a house that had been, probably about 6 months before orange groves. And in hindsight, I think I came into a layered, complicated cultural landscape. I didn't know that at the time, but I was incredibly fortunate to have very history-minded family, even though we were living in a tract home. And you might not expect that. It might seem incongruous to some, but for me, it became a really important part of my journey to understand how both our families around us had both arrived there, and really what had happened before we got there. That sustaining kind of spirit of inquiry and understanding was inculcated at a very young age. When I was 10, my great aunt died, and we had a very short amount of time for the whole family to get everything out of her very large Victorian house in Inglewood, where they'd moved in 1903, and not much had changed since 1903 in that house. And I'll never forget sitting on the stairwell and with the light coming through the stained glass windows and watching all the adults go through all this historic material. And And my dad, being, the lower generation, the younger generation, found a chest in the feed barn, in the feed storage shed, because she, of course, had chickens. And he thought it was a Civil War cavalry chest, and it was. And it was filled with letters from, we had 3 brothers drew straws. 2 of them went to fight for the Union. They left the farm in Illinois, and 1 stayed behind. And so these were the letters that were sent from the field to the brothers. So imagine you're a little girl, 4th grade in suburban Southern California, and your dad gets to bring in a Civil War cavalry chest and with letters, and we had the accompanying sword, very cool for some of the young 4th graders. But I'd like to think of that moment. My dad still has the chest. I later taught with those letters as when I was teaching U.S. history at La Sierra University. And I think that at the same time, that feeling that we were about to lose that history happened because my great aunt had never married. She gave her beautiful house to her church, and the church tore it down the week after we took everything out. So that sense of fragility too of history, that it needs to be stewarded and needs to be kept, was certainly instilled in me at a young age.
It sounds like even at that young age, you developed your sense for the materiality of history. I'm thinking of the sword, which is so important to your professional career.
Yeah. On my mom's side, she had come to teach math and science from Rhode Island as a young woman out of undergraduate school, and she had an amazing family, an Irish immigrant family. And my grandmother, who I don't remember well, would always bring things to us and to her that she knew that my mother loved, right? That she would bring some kind of an heirloom. And so certainly that materiality was reinforced simultaneously in that kind of young, tender age, which is why I think K through 12 and even pre-K through 12 or pre-K through 14, if not 16, education is so important, and instilling that awareness of our place in the great experiment of humanity. I had we had an amazing young community of teachers, and one of whom wrote a book on the native California Indian history of Cucamonga, of that valley. And so I kind of thought that almost everyone that knew the complicated histories of their place. I had hoped that people would better understand the land on which they were living, and if you didn't understand the pain and the complications of how history had unfolded there, but at least you understood it was deep, right? And had a deepness that maybe you couldn't see, that was below ground or held in story or held in sacredness or community. And to this day, I'm here in Washington D.C. I'm on the ancestral lands that were shared by the Piscataway, the Nacotchtank, and they're, as you know, the descendants are here. Our communities are very rich with Native peoples from all over the continent, especially here in Washington and in Los Angeles. But yet we still, I think, struggle to recognize that. So I think it was a gift that teacher named Don Klukas wrote "Light Over the Mountain," which we think is what Cucamonga means, and that I was exposed to that at an early age. Later, I realized that my high school was built on an Indian burial ground. Yeah.
So you had, even before you knew that, you had both a sense of the importance of history and of the complexity of history, as well as of its materiality. What sort of consciousness did you bring with you to UCLA when you majored as an undergraduate?
Oh, well, I was going to be an English major. Oh no, I wasn't going to be a historian. No, I was going to be an English major. And because I love literature, I love the written word. I was infatuated with, and I still am. And I took my first couple of history classes and just completely fell in love. The professors who were there, and these were big survey classes. These are Scott Waz classes, it was taught in a way that made history come alive. It wasn't just the primary sources, which I loved, which I grew to love even more, and understanding the archival record, the silences of it, the complicated nature of it, and the stewardship needs of it. Of course, I think about every day. But it was made to come alive in ways that were resonant to my current self, right? They were resonant to my current struggles, or my families, or our communities, and so it was very powerful. So after my first history class, my freshman year, I was rowing crew for UCLA, and I never missed an opportunity to get a little workout in. And so I put my 10-speed bike on my shoulder, and I took the stairs up to the history department, which I think was in Bunch Hall, 6th floor. Is it still there?
It still is.
Okay. And I just declared I wanted to be a history major. And I think probably the secretary, God love her, was like, okay, hon, all right, come on in. And so I never really looked back. I ended up falling in love with colonial U.S. history, really at the tutelage of Gary Nash. His Path-Breaking Red, White, and Black had just come out. And looking back on it now, it's two key things, David. It's place-based. Gary in particular, completely then and now, to use your frame, I think completely understood the importance of starting on the ground. An incredible, powerful guiding philosophy of a lot of social historians, and saw instantly the framing of the colonial experience as a set of encounters, as a set of intersections, as we might call them now, and as a very powerful and complicated and messy and difficult and challenging set of cultural clashes and exchanges. And so the bursting through of the hegemonic, especially narrative of the creation of the country, was done by one of the masters in the field. And so I was incredibly fortunate to be at UCLA at that time. I was there from 82 to 86.
And did you have a sense then that this was your calling, that you too would share in this work of complicating the received historical narrative, and would be interested in what our friend and colleague Steve Aaron likes to think of as the convergences of history? Right.
I did. At Gary's urging, I applied for an education at home program that he knew about very well, because one of his mentees, Dr. Sharon Salinger, had started her career at UC Riverside and had created this program with Ed Galstead, one of the founding faculty of UC Riverside's history department, and Ed, amazing historian of U.S. religion. And so for a quarter, we lived in Colonial Williamsburg, the winter quarter, right when you could live in Colonial Williamsburg, and we did an immersive colonial U.S. history class. So I was going to be a colonialist, David. I was all set. And I also, thanks to Sharon and Gary, applied to UC Riverside, where Sharon was, and then I received a full scholarship to start my PhD there, which I was, again, still convinced I was going to be a colonialist and study gender and politics in Quaker Philadelphia. But
what happened on the way to the floor?
As luck would happen, I took a turn. I took for the time, and Sharon and I have talked about this since, the UCR History Department had a long parallel track of a public history program, which they called the Program in Historic Resource Management. And after I'd finished my master's coursework, I switched to that program. And that was not without some mini departmental drama, because I was on kind of what they call the regular PhD track, and I had switched. But it proved to be one of the most important choices in my career, because I felt grounded, or constantly learning in a lot of the kind of rich research and historiographical training. But then when I switched over to the program in Historic Resources Management, which is now just simply called the Public History Program there, it opened up 3 tracks: archival management, museum studies, and historic preservation. So for me, it it made sense then. In fact, one of my professors, when I switched, you'll love this considering the Luskin Center's name, said, you would actually be really good in policy. And I don't know if he meant it nicely, but I took that and I ran with it. And after I finished my master's in public history, I went back to Colonial Williamsburg and interned there, which was a required part of the program, which I still to this day cannot emphasize internships, paid internships in particular. All of our internships now at the museum, at the Smithsonian, are paid. And then I was lucky to be a part of the first class in American Studies PhD at William & Mary. That was, which was a really remarkable experience. I moved back to California, though, when one of my professors at UCR kindly had forwarded me that the town up in which I had grown was advertising for its very first public historian, a specialist in historic preservation. And on a whim, I applied, and they flew me out, and I was offered the job. And I thought, okay, who gets to come back home and really start? I started an oral history project. We started a landmark project. We did, or enhanced the landmark project. We did interpretive public and art projects. We started the city's archives. And when you're 25, I hope I was gracious and humble, but now looking back, I think what an incredible opportunity to start really applying my role as a public historian and a public servant.
And what did you learn there in that job?
Oh my goodness. Well, I worked for two cities, the city of Rancho Cucamonga, and then a more mature city, the former heart of the Citrus Belt, Riverside. And I called it my second master's. I learned so much, David, about how decisions are made that shape environments. I learned how much or sometimes how little public officials are briefed and truly, I think, understand how they may replicate systems of inequality, how they may, by their very core decisions, how much power they actually have in those city budgets. Especially in Riverside, but also in Rancho Cucamonga, I really started to understand what we collectively call, and what has been called really since the 1920s, cultural landscapes, right? When you actually think about the contours of the depth of how the land has changed over time and what forces are at play there. I also learned a lot about urban planning, which to this day, as well as architecture. I've taken a lot of architectural history classes at UCLA because Tom Hines was there. I mean, it was an amazing time to be at UCLA. I think any time is an amazing time to be at UCLA. But so I got to weave all of that, right? And there wasn't necessarily one part of my public historian kind of new chapters in verse, if you will. I was writing the book that I didn't feel I used, even legal history, right? When I became more involved in historic preservation, all the tools that I've learned from people of the past in terms of how to be good advocates, and how to be good activists even, came into play as well. So it was a truly remarkable time. And I also, I think, learned a lot about both workplace and cultural and social, racial, gender-based inequalities, inequities, and really how those played themselves out and how we even went about thinking about recording history, saving history, what we landmark, what we preserve, right, what we hold dear, is an incredible testament to the values that we hold and the power that is shaped by them.
So as you were developing your understanding of what public history is, mindful of all these impulses and instincts and sensitivities that you're developing in the 1980s, how would you say?
In 90s, yeah. My first job was 1990, yeah.
In the 90s, yes. In the 90s. So how would you say your vision of public history and more generally public history have changed over the last 30 years or so?
That's a wonderful question, David. I do think about that. I've been afforded chances to think about that. One of I think the key ways in which I believe and I hope I've helped is to serve as bridges, like even to build them or just to hold them together when they already exist, and to strengthen them when you find them, is to bridge the methodologies, the scholarship, the findings, the depth to which historians now at this for, well, thousands of years. We've had historians, hundreds of thousands of years probably, but thousands that we know of. And but as a modern profession, really growing up, if you will, since the 1880s, we're at an incredibly rich and very mature moment in the profession. But that maturity and that scholarship and that interpretation, those lenses, if you will, don't necessarily always make their way into public commemoration. So that distance, that gap between what we see on a roadside marker, what we see on a monument, or what we see in a museum, and scholarship. And the scholarship that is evolving and is taking shape in every history department across the nation doesn't always then translate. So sometimes I felt in my career that I'm almost a translator, right? That I'm taking scholarship and research, doing work with it in public with community, not to community, but with community. I also think that I've seen a transference of the understanding that agency and power and authority are best served shared, right? That we can work with and share our tools, democratize the tools of an historian. I joke that I'm not a brain surgeon, but I like to change minds. And I think that transference, if you will, has been really key. You've also seen the public history kind of come into its own. My very first board I was asked to serve on, I'm a big believer in service and nonprofit service, was the California Council for the Promotion of History, which was based on the National Council of Public History. And I ended up serving on their board too, but who had I think a slightly more defined, that tripartite design that I experienced at UCR, of archival management, museum studies, historic preservation. I think what we've seen is a simultaneous kind of merging of those to really get into a kind of a consolidated cultural heritage management, historic resource management, framing. And I think that's all for the better, because simultaneously, we've then also applied all of the new tools of our trade, geographic information systems, mapping systems, digital humanities, in-depth projects that weave community story with place, that tackle kind of the older hierarchies, really, if you will, of the way in which, whether it be the National Register of Historic Places deemed something important, or a museum like the Smithsonian deemed it important. So it's an amazing time to be an historian.
Yeah. I mean, it is an amazing time, and thank you for charting your own path. I really resonate with the idea of translation, which I've often thought exactly my task, and the task of historians. And I like the added category, the psychoanalytic category of transference. But the translational model presumes unidirectionality. And in fact, the flow is not simply from exalted scholars in the ivory tower to the public, but far more multi-directional than that. And I'm wondering, how you brought that more multi-directional approach to your work. For example, at the California Historical Society, which was the penultimate stop in your career to date.
Right. Well, thank you for asking. So when I arrived at CHS, I was so grateful to be there because I had been, the regional director for the Western region for the National Trust the years before that. And before that, I had been a professor, but simultaneously serving as the chair of the State Historic Resources Commission under Governors Davis and then later Brown. So I had come to the California Historical Society dealing with immovable heritage. Most historic places and sacred sites you can't move very easily. But what I had come to CHS with was a long developed, for which I'm very grateful and live in kind of grateful humility for, of working with communities, whether they be in Rancho Cucamonga, Riverside, who understood innately the importance of the power of place, as Dolores Hayden framed it in her great work that, some of which was done at UCLA. There's a wonderful Adrienne Rich poem that one of the lines is that we reconstitute the world. Do you know that poem? My heart is, hold on just a sec, I'll grab it for you. I'll find it and share it with you. But it talks about this kind of, we are to try to reconstitute the world when there's so much unmaking, right? There's so much kind of disassociation with story and erasure of the past. So working with a remarkable range of communities, whether it was the Japanese American community in Riverside at the Harada House, whether it was with Native Chamorro activists and advocates in historic preservation in Guam. I'd already kind of come to CHS with many, many gifts bestowed on me of that, as you said, that beautiful interplay, right? That transference of knowledge. And I'd worked with numerous tribes around California and the West. We had done significant work with the broader Asian American, Asian Pacific Islander community, with the Latino community, communities, plural. So CHS provided this remarkable opportunity to really go back in a way to the original documents, right? To go back into the archives. It has one of the most important special collections in the state. If you put Bancroft State Library and the Huntington and CHS together, you really have the bulk of the more, of the more significant special collections in the state. So combining that with a remarkable opportunity to create exhibits, which was a brand new experience for me. I called on an incredible friend who had just left the UCLA's Hammer Museum, Jessica Howe, and said, "Hey, I have 3 months to do an exhibit on the Golden Gate Bridge and celebrating the 75th. And she said, "You're joking, right?" I said, "No, this is what I inherited. This is my, this was pledged by my dear predecessor." And we did it. We brought kind of an artful mentality to exhibition creation, but in doing those exhibits, and we ended up doing between online and in situ, we probably ended up doing almost 20 of them. We also then tested out all kinds of different partnerships, different ways of creating exhibits, different reasons, commemorative, otherwise, working with artists, working with historians, working with community members, and then reclaiming stories like Juana Briones, which we did with Al Camarillo at Stanford and an incredible group of people. Imagine doing an exhibition on a 19th century Afro-Latina who we have no pictures of. We have nothing written that she left us, but yet whose lifespan, the entirety, to the 1889. So imagine what she saw. We got into that work because her house was demolished when I was still with the National Trust. One of the last vestiges, her rancho was adjacent to Stanford's, just to give you some geolocation. So those projects helped me understand that incredible weave, right, of, again, as you said, of materiality, of preservation practice. We opened up the Juana Briones exhibition with a portion of the wall of her house that had been salvaged, that we restored in situ inside the California Historical Society, and with the legal case, a copy of the briefs that showed all of this, again, applied history, right? Applying our tools as a historian to try and reclaim the stories of the past, to save what was left of this incredible woman's life. So it rolled up all together for me, an incredible understanding of the power, certainly, of exhibitions. We were also able to work with our partners in the state, and at the State Library in particular, and the State Office of Education, to create, and to start creating anyway, a large public primary source-driven project, Teaching California, which again tried to open up not just our archives, but the archives of repositories all across the state to align to California's new K-12 history and social science standards. One of the key things I also learned at CHS, and this is, I think, so pertinent for the great work you're doing at the center, is that history to survive and thrive in a state as vast as the nation state of California, public-private partnerships are absolutely essential. In the end, I and many others gave our all to the California Historical Society, and they still are giving their all there. But when you set up a state-mandated historical society as a nonprofit, the search for a sustainable business model, like so many nonprofits in California, becomes your number one search. So you have to both keep all of the momentum of running a nonprofit and all of the momentum of running the best, most attuned, most dedicated historical society you can for the people of your state. And so that was a remarkable challenge and a remarkable gift. And I'm still very close to them. And I truly hope that the leadership of the state looks across the state's heritage and cultural landscape and arts landscape. I think they're doing better recently on the arts, and just realizes how important it is to California.
So, you've just described how deeply rooted you are in the history of the state of California, how you devoted so much to unpacking the complexity, to attending to the ruptures and the inequities and the sources of fascination of California history. Why, pray tell, did you pick up and leave California?
Right.
And I mean, the allure is obvious, but could you tell us what it was like to make a decision to come to the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian Institution?
I'd love to. I said to you before, David, that if my time with cities was my second master's, I joked that my time at the National Trust and CHS was my second PhD. So I don't know what I'm getting now, but I have been, and again, this is probably my training as well as my proclivities. For me, understanding the richness of California is really understanding the richness of the world. And I don't mean that in any kind of arrogant way that California is the world, but California is a lot of the world, as you know. But I was also incredibly fortunate when I was at the National Trust. We ran the office of the Western office out of San Francisco, but we worked in the 8 Western states and territories of Guam and Micronesia for a DC-based nonprofit, the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So my modalities were always kind of, especially trans-bordered, as you know, because many of our borders are so artificial. And I spent a lot of time really in those 8 Western states, including Alaska and Hawaii, and a bit of time in Guam, as I mentioned previously. I was also fortunate to be the guest of the New Zealand Trust when I was at the National Trust, and had some, and it's not incredibly global, but I craved those kind of different perspectives, because in the Pacific in particular, we saw then, and from Africa and Latin America as well, we started to see this incredible indigenous-led movement of decolonization, which is a huge part of what museums, and I think all historians and all historic repositories are needing to and now are engaging. So I was always impressed and always had followed, of course, the National Museum of American History. I remember going there as a girl. My dad remembers going there. I have my dad's scrapbook from when he went in 1950, before it was in its current building. I got to know some of the Smithsonian leadership better when we had conversations about whether or not we could do a project together in San Francisco. And so I was so honored, as you would guess, when they asked if I were interested. And, first and I said yes. And first I was one of 6, and then I was one of 3, and then I was one of 2 candidates. And it remains to this day an incredible honor. But as to why, the opportunities to steward the nation's collection, as you know, we've conservatively 1.8 million objects and 3 linear miles of shelf miles of archival material. And that's pretty conservatively assessed. It's an 800,000 square foot building on 14 acres. It's as old as I am. I like to joke we have deep roots, but at 56-year-old self, almost 57, it opened in 1964. And I think one of the more amazing collections of historians, educators, communicators, deeply devoted, people who specialize in programming, people who specialize in exhibition design, at a time when, let's say I was recruited in 2018 and I started in 2019, at a time when I thought that history was starting to matter more and more. Remember, that was Lin-Manuel Hamilton, history has its eyes on you. All of a sudden, history is doing things. History is judging you. And as you and I know, David, history doesn't do anything. Historians do. And the opportunity to embrace that mantle, right? To set out a vision, which we set out the first couple months I was there, at what the most accessible, inclusive, relevant, and sustainable. I added that a couple weeks later, but what that meant. What did the most accessible, inclusive, relevant, and sustainable public history institution and public museum in the nation look like in 2030? So we claimed that vision, we embraced that vision, and then we had an outdated strategic plan, just because it ended in 2018, when they were searching for my position and when my predecessor, John Gray, left in May of that year. And our staff and then our board came up with and then embraced a new mission, right? Empowering people to create a more just and compassionate future by sharing, preserving, and exploring the complexities of the past. And you could argue that, and people did, like, well, why are you empowering? Why aren't you just educating? There's a key difference between those words. Of course, our main mission is education, public history education, or science history education, or air and space, or history of art, or the remarkableness of the newer museums like the National Museum of the American Indian, or of course, National Museum of African American History and Culture. So the chance to paint on that size of a canvas, if you will, was incredible. And I also feel very at home in DC. My sister lived here for a while. She's back in California now. The shattering impacts of the 6th of January, which I'm happy to talk about, were so much more felt. I live here on Capitol Hill. This is an 1855 little barracks row house, probably built in part at least by enslaved persons. So kind of living here and feeling that has been just an incredible kind of gift of an experience. And then leading leading through COVID. We're about to be a year.
Yeah. Well, I mean, talk about being an eyewitness to history. I mean, you really were right on the front lines. But I want to just go back and have you talk about your arrival in Washington, D.C. in 2019 in the midst of one of the most fractious, tumultuous, dysfunctional periods in American political history, and particularly in Washington, D.C.
Right.
And there you are, embarking upon a new strategic vision for your institution in that extraordinarily fractious and contentious environment. I mean, what was that like? What kinds of pressures did you feel around you? What kinds of conflicts did you either get in or into or avoid?
Right.
And how did you manage to how did you manage to steer the ship of the museum to this goal of empowering people to create a just and compassionate future through a recourse to the past?
Oh, thank you for asking. That's a great question. I think steering, if I could, just amend your verb tense. I was incredibly fortunate. I mean, I was hired by Dr. David Skorton when he was secretary, and then right after my appointment was announced, David announced that he was moving on as well. So when Secretary Lonnie Bunch the third became the 14th secretary, the first African American, the first historian, and the first former museum director to lead the Smithsonian, there was a remarkable sense of alignment. Lonnie is not just a truly remarkable human being, an incredible historian, but who too had spent time at the California African American Museum in Los Angeles. He'd been at the Smithsonian, he'd been at the Chicago History Center. And then of course spent 13 amazing years, building the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So to have that alignment, right, to have a public historian at the helm of the Smithsonian, none other than Lonnie himself, was and remains a remarkable both partnership, but also a remarkable alignment, if you will, of Lonnie's innate understanding of the power of what we can do. We are very, very careful, and we teach each other a lot, I think, throughout the Smithsonian. We pride ourselves on our nonpartisanship. As you know, it's set up with the Board of Regents. The chair of the Regents, who I've had the honor of getting to know, is always the acting Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, rather. So this one, Chief Justice John Roberts takes his role very seriously. He's a history major from Harvard, and he loves the Smithsonian. He loves being the titular head of the Smithsonian Board of Regents. So the nonpartisan nature, though, I think historians in particular in the room have also helped everyone understand that our very being is political. My body is political, right? Historians are trained to think that lowercase p, and especially throughout really the post civil rights era, but you could argue for much of our past, we've worked in political ways. Our exhibition that opened on the history of girls, the thesis is that girlhood is politicized and political, and that girls can act in political ways. So it's not something we shirk from, especially since we have an incredible department of political historians, filled with political historians. But it's something we try and kind of continuously bring into the world, that the work we're doing in public history, we try and tread very carefully in understanding to bring a full interpretation, an intersectional interpretation to what we do. I also felt, and Lonnie did as well, because he approved of my issuing them, that the museum's duty as a public institution, our duty as public servants and public historians, pushed us to help people contextualize what we've been through the past couple of years. And, as you know, my statements, whether it be on COVID or on George Floyd's killing, whether it be what happened just a couple of weeks ago now at the insurrection on the Capitol, were an attempt at least to start a conversation that's rooted in history, rooted in historiography, that then tries to marry a contemporary understanding of how that history is bringing forth, how we're stitching in time, if you will. And that same day, yeah, go ahead.
It sounds like you're really pushing in what, to my mind, seemed very productive way, that balance between being an inescapably political being and institution and being nonpartisan. Not every historical museum would issue statements, on January 6th. They would play it safe. And it seems to me very felicitous and salutary that you did so. I'm wondering, A, what was the reaction, and B, what the work of navigation is like.
Sure.
I mean, you've described Chief Justice Roberts
Sure.
as sympathetic.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are other players involved, and I'm
there are
sure
many players. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sure.
What's it like?
Well, and remember, we're 2/3 funded by Congress, right? Yeah, we receive the museum. The Smithsonian is about a $1.5 billion operation, and right around $1 billion of that comes from Congress, comes from the people, and we take that incredibly seriously. On the 6th, one of the key things, as well as actually for COVID, for race-based killings, and for police brutality, and for everything that we've witnessed, huge economic disparities, the impacts of systemic racism. One of the amazing things about working at the National Museum of American History is because we actually have the materiality to talk about it. So before COVID, when 2020 was going to be just a complicated election year, our teams had a plan all laid out that we had worked on the year before when I first came, and like we had done for the past probably 10 presidential elections, we were in the field collecting. So our political historians like to joke, like when they were in Iowa for the caucus, they were probably the only people going to all of the rallies, right? Because that's how they would collect. That was part of our collecting plan. So we focused on the 6th, on that day. That was the peaceful transference of power day, right? When you had the constitutionally mandated joint session of Congress presided over the Vice President of the United States. That had basically been that way since about 1800. So not only did we have material to talk about and reflect back on that transference and how that was so violently interrupted, we had also I think, not just the collections base, but the work of our historians to understand what also had happened that morning in Georgia, right? With the validation of the Georgia senatorial race, and that the first African American senator of a former Confederate state was going back since Reconstruction. So, and then really framing Reconstruction for a lot of people who, for historians, that's a critical part of American history. But as you know, we've had to kind of reteach ourselves as a public about that time frame and about the election of 1876. So again, I guess, David, it's kind of bringing our work as historians, bringing our work as stewards of the national collection, and figuring out where we can be of utility. How can we help people? How can we reflect? And saving our words on that level, director's statement, for when the nation is thrown into those moments where the crisis is so painful or is so consuming. And what I think, as we grow into now our almost year mark of being shut down, mostly shut down due to the pandemic, I started talking last fall about the cascading crisis. And I think one of my comments, one of my statements reflected that of viral, racial, economic, and then climate. And it's not just in California with with the horrific wildfire season we had last year, but the many, many ways we're seeing the crisis of climate impact both our nation and our pale blue dot, as Carl Sagan likes to say, the only home we've ever known. So the process of review and writing these, of course, it's kind of like any other kind of complicated piece of 2 pages long, and a lot of great thinking went into it. But again, my goal is always, what's that higher purpose? What can we do to give people at least the start of the conversation? I would love if we could convene the conversations. We're convening them online, of course, like everyone else is. And I can't wait for the day where we can both do that, of course, because that's a great democratizing and tool of accessibility when you can do things online. But I so look forward to the day when we can actually bring back people into the museum to do the same.
So I'm curious, what is your responsibility as custodian, in some sense, of the nation's history, or at least through the institutional medium of the museum? What is your responsibility to capture and present and give voice to tens of millions of people who believe that Joe Biden was not elected president, that it was a hoax, a fraud, right, and there was a very intricate conspiracy, Donald Trump, from being reelected. I'm just curious, how do you imagine future curators will present that, will sort of capture that memory, which is so important to understand the moment we're in?
Yeah. Oh, it's a great question, David. We are beholden to our own standards of curation and our own standards of professionalism to collect representations, right, of what we all witness happening, and we build that right into the political history collection. In particular, it's not just in political history, of course, collections, and we're collecting people who think that COVID is a hoax. We're collecting people, from people who think that the vaccine is dangerous. But we also walk a fine line, which I will own, of also not encouraging what we know to be anti-scientific, anti-humanitarian, anti-historical opinions that violate our own kind of code of ethics. See what I mean? It's this kind of constant kind of mirroring. When we collected the morning after on the 7th of January, over promotion of hanging by their heels, stop the steal, and and all of the things that we collected off with their heads. Over promotion of promoting acts of violence is never a place we want to be in. But we also have to collect a representative sample of what we experienced. Increasingly, we could also do that photographically, right? I don't need to collect mountains of material from the insurrection, but I need to make sure that we don't miss an opportunity to collect the ephemeral. We may have many, many opportunities in the future to collect. So rapid response collecting, which is kind of, this falls under as some of our COVID work does too, and some of our Black Lives Matter work definitely did, because we also tried to figure out how to safely collect in the field during a pandemic, which is not easy, as you might guess. So rapid response collecting has been made very challenging this past almost year, but it still remains a guiding principle for us that, again, to collect material that we may forever lose. That handmade sign on a restaurant in New York City that said, COVID's here, but we'll be back in 2 weeks. That of course is an incredible challenge, but one that I think is also incredibly important.
Well, we could obviously continue for many more hours to take up these questions, but the hour is coming to a close, and I want to ask you a final question.
Certainly. And I can read you that poem. Yeah.
Okay, that could be a summation too, and it's connected because I want to ask you to, in a certain sense, summarize and distill the essence of what you do and what you have been doing so brilliantly for the last several decades.
30 years. It's 31 this year. Yeah.
No, I've been in life for 30 years. I kill it. Where has the time gone? But it's a very simple question. What does history teach us? What do you want and expect for history to do for yourself and for the public that you serve?
I think that history teaches us humility. I think it teaches us our own agency and our own power. If anything, I hope it teaches us our own interconnectivity and our own responsibilities and accountabilities to each other, and how fragile those bonds can be, whether they be between two people or to an entire, construction of a republic on which we all try and stand. I will end with a poem, if you don't mind. It's short. It's from Adrienne Rich, from her Dreams of a Common Language that was published in 1978. My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who, age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. A passion to make and make again, where such unmaking reigns. Thank
you, Anthea Hartig, for such a wonderful way to end and for such a rich conversation on Then and Now. It's really been a most illuminating hour. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. As I opened, it's truly an honor to be here, and I'm so incredibly proud of the work that you're doing and anything I can do to help.
Thank you. And we're so delighted that you were in the position you were in, and we wish you the best of luck.
Oh, thank you.
It's an extremely important task at this moment, at this very, very extraordinary moment in time. And thank you to our listeners out there. Let us know your thoughts on this or other episodes of Then and Now by emailing us at luskincenter@history.ucla.edu, LUSKIN center@history.ucla.edu. And special thanks, of course, to our executive producer, Maya Ferdman. Until next time, wishing you a pleasant and safe day. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us this week on Then and Now. Then and Now is brought to you by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy, where we study change to make change. For more on our work, follow us on Twitter and Facebook at our handle, @LuskinHistory. Our show is produced by Maya Ferdman and David Myers, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.